Welcome everyone to the Pat and Mike Show. Today we're going to jump into asset protection. We're going to talk a lot about what asset protection is, how it works, who needs it. I'm Mike Rakowski. Next to me, wait, this way, Patrick Carrier. We're both from the Rakowski Law Firm. We're estate preservation and asset protection attorneys.
All right, Mike, thanks for the intro to both of us. So just wanted to kind of give a little bit of an overview today of what is asset protection. We originally started doing a lot of kind of estate planning work, kind of traditional estate planning work back in the day, but that's not really today's major concern. Today's major concern is how do we protect people's assets? People work really, really hard. They build up what they have. And because of an illness, because of a divorce, because of a lawsuit, people can lose everything, practically overnight. So what strategies exist from a legal point of view to protect against that? And how do we make sure that the families that we serve are protected in the event of, divorce, long-term care costs, nursing care costs? What if there's a car accident, bankruptcy, all that good stuff? Well, not good stuff, but all those risks.
And Pat, would you agree that, a lot of times families come to us, they start with the question of like, how do I avoid probate? Probate seems to be, it's time consuming, it's expensive. And so people start by, first the conversation or the goal of avoiding probate. But, in our practice, that's pretty straightforward. Would you agree?
I would agree, which is not to say that it's unimportant. Avoiding probate is still a really good idea.
Right.
Yeah. But to have that be the be all and end all of it really misses a lot of potential benefits and a lot of potential pitfalls that people can come across.
Because truly so much can happen from this moment in time when I plan until the time I pass away. Like you mentioned, what if I got in a car accident and are sued, right? What if incapacity planning, if I can no longer make decisions for myself? A lot of times that road from right now until passing away can be such a incredibly complicated legal journey versus just, and I don't mean to downplay it at all, but I want to avoid probate when I pass away. There's so many other things to consider.
Oh, absolutely. And we're in Michigan, which is a relatively okay state for probate. Some states are an absolute nightmare. Some, it's all right. And Michigan falls into the all right category. But all right just means you're only talking a few months and a few percentage points of your estate. I mean, if you could avoid doing that, why would you not? But we're not talking the same kind of liability, the same kind of risk that exists for those long-term care costs. What if your kids wind up getting divorced? What if you wind up getting sued? All of that from a dollars and cents and from a hardship point of view is a much bigger concern for most people out there.
Sure. So let's start with, let's just look at what is the legal definition of asset protection planning. And I'm just going to read it here because I got it that way I don't screw this up. So it's legal planning that is designed to place your assets beyond the reach of future creditors. And that's a really important thing, right, Pat, with the future versus present.
The future part.
Yep. Yeah. Because a quick little example of that is, let's say you get in a car accident today and something bad happens. The person that you hit, you're at fault, they're hospitalized, and that it's going to be expensive. You can't then come to us and say, hey, I just got in this really big car accident. Can you protect all my assets? That's a lot different than doing pre-planning.
Right. And I think that has to get to kind of the heart of what we're talking about when we're saying asset protection, because there's a few different aspects to this that I think it's important to kind of separate out. First up, we are attorneys. We're not insurance salespeople. That's not what we do. So we're not talking about insurance. We will talk a little bit about that. It's a good idea, probably, depending on your situation. But there's insurance as a protection. There is the structural type solutions like real estate, corporate structures, trust structures. We're going to talk quite a bit about that today because that's more of our wheelhouse. And then you're talking about the if somebody's already in an accident, they haven't protected themselves from that liability. That's where you hire an attorney to defend yourself, where you can see this storm coming down on you because you've already got the liability. And once that's happened, that's when you're calling the insurance company to be like, hey, pay those lawyers to fight this off as best we can, and then we'll settle it. Right. But if we do our job beforehand, before that liability is there, we can avoid that fight almost entirely. In some cases entirely.
Yeah, that person, it would be a known creditor. So, that's a lot more difficult than putting a plan in place today that could protect from things that you don't know about yet, or that are not present creditors.
Correct. And that really gets into the heart of this, which is why would you be sued, and what is it, or why would you have expenses, creditors, risks, and who is the person who has those risks, and who has the assets? So all of this, whether we're talking probate or asset protection, it all really comes down to two things: ownership and control. Who owns something and who controls something. Because if you have total ownership and total control, then if a creditor has a judgment against you, or if you owe money, or if they have a claim, then they can get after anything that's owned by you. So one of the fundamental principles of asset protection is, how do we separate out ownership and control? How do we set it up so that you can still continue to have and use and enjoy all those things? Things could be, your home or a cottage. Things could also be, investment accounts. How do you continue to have the full use of those assets, but we separate out the ownership enough that if you're sued personally, they can't get after whatever it may be? Or if you have long-term care needs, if you need to go to a nursing home, how do we set it up so that they don't drain down all of your assets? How do we separate that out?
Right. So let's dive into each of those a little bit then. So the first part, let's talk about ownership. And so how do we give away ownership without just giving our stuff away, right? I mean, that's the idea there is, yeah, of course, could we just give away our stuff to our kids? Well, for sure, but now you don't have it, you don't own it, you don't control it. I mean, that's pretty.
And what happens if your kid gets sick or divorced or sued or something like that? All you did was switch it from you to somebody else.
There it goes. Right. For sure. For sure. So that's where we start looking at things like trust, because it fundamentally, if you put your asset into a trust, now the trust owns the asset. You no longer own it. The trust owns it. You still might control it because the terms of the trust say that you do or don't, but that is a very fundamental thing that we do on the legal side of things. Another thing that you might do is create a business entity. Let's say you have a rental property. Maybe you create an LLC to cut off liability from that rental property to you personally. So that's another avenue. Again, it's all looking at everyone's certain, their unique circumstances and what type of comfort level do they have, what kind of asset protection do they need, right?
Yeah, there's two important, similar, but definitely distinct areas you touched on right there. One is that the trust planning, the estate planning component to it, and one is the business structure side to it. They're both areas of law, and they're both within this asset protection structure, but they work differently, but similar. So it's important to understand. I think with the rental property, that one is really, really simple. I think for people who haven't worked in this area before, it's a pretty straightforward concept. So if you set up something like an LLC, like there you're talking limited liability. So if you have a home that you own in your own name, it goes back to those two things: ownership and control. If the house is in your name, you own it and you control it. Meaning if you didn't fix that back step and somebody falls and gets injured, then they are suing you personally. So anything that you have, because you owned the house and you controlled it, they'll come after you. But if the home is held in an LLC, then absent gross negligence or you doing something really, really, really bad, the liability is limited to that property or to the value of what's held in the LLC. Because then when they're suing, they're not suing you. They're not suing Mike Rutkowski, the person. They're suing, Rutkowski Homes LLC, which maybe just has that one rental property in it. So the liability is limited just to those assets. And that's just one of those fundamental things. Now you control that property. Absolutely, you control that property. But do you own that property? No, the LLC does, and you control the LLC. And that difference is enough to separate out that liability, protect you and your family personally in the event of a lawsuit there.
Right. And some good, we're going to jump into definitely some differences in how to protect using a trust to do so. But, I would say that's like the first level of asset protection, because something could still happen in your personal life that if you own the LLC, they could go after that LLC. But that definitely adds some added protection to you on top of insurance coverage that you might have on the property.
100%. Well, and that's a really good example where you're saying, would you have insurance coverage? So you might think, oh, I've got an LLC. They're just suing that. I don't need insurance. You certainly do. You would want to have insurance in that situation. But the question is, who's the target? If you have an LLC, the LLC is being sued and the insurance is paying to defend that lawsuit, limited to just that property. But if you have it personally and you have insurance, they're still suing you. They're still suing you personally. And you would have the insurance to try to fight those claims or settle those claims. But it's still, who's the target? Is it you or is it a rental property? And you would want it to just be whatever's held in that LLC.
For sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But
that's a great example.
And to say, just to kind of segue into what you were talking about, the trust structure, any LLC, any corporate structure is a one-way protection. It only goes one way. So what that means is if you've got that same situation, that same home, and it's in an LLC and somebody gets hurt, then the liability is limited. But what if you're out there driving down the street and you get in a car accident? Or what if you develop Alzheimer's and you need to go into long-term care? The LLC protects you from liability from the property, but it doesn't protect those assets from other claims against you or other expenses you might have. So you're not getting sued out of the LLC, but you have to go to a nursing home or you get sued. They're able to come back after that because you're the one who holds that LLC, right? It only goes the one way. And that's where trusts can play a major role.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how I feel like the trust is taking it to the next level, level of asset protection, right? Because within a trust, we get to, so we've covered the ownership thing. We can give it to a trust. We can give it to some type of business entity. But now on the control side of things, we can use the trust to really determine how much control over the assets there are, which again plays into, what's your risk tolerance and, how much control do you want to give away to add asset protection?
Precisely. And that has to do with what type of trust structure you're setting up. That's another thing that we get all the time is people will say, oh, I want to do a trust, or I don't because I had this experience with one before. And then the question is, well, what type of trust? Like, what are your goals? What is it that you're looking to accomplish? Because when you say, I have a trust, that doesn't tell you a whole lot. It gives you a rough idea of what the structure looks like. But there's dozens, if not hundreds, of different types of trusts out there. And within them, there's all sorts of variation on control, authority, what they do. You see these extremely basic, extremely simple, revocable trusts that people have set up. Those have one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to avoid probate. They do absolutely nothing for asset protection.
I would say that is probably one of the biggest misconceptions that I see. And it's interesting you brought this up because I was just talking to a financial advisor yesterday who said he can't believe how many families come to him with their trust. They want to tie it to their assets for funding, and they think they have asset protection just because they have a trust. And looking at the trust, it's just what you said. It's a standard revocable living trust, which has benefits of, a little bit of control on the distribution of assets to your beneficiaries, and it avoids probate. And really, that's the end of the road with a revocable living trust. Both of which are very good benefits. But if one of your goals was asset protection, there's clearly some miscommunication there on what you ended up getting versus what you were looking for.
For sure. And even to that point, we're talking today about asset protection for you being the person who's setting it up. If you're setting up this trust, how are you protected from liability, from lawsuits, bankruptcy, long-term care costs? There's a lot also that can be done under that asset protection heading to protect things for the next generation. How do we protect the kids from addiction, from divorce, from their own potential financial mismanagement? There's a lot that can be done there, and you can do some of that with the right type of revocable trust. But most revocable trusts don't even consider that. They just say, hey, when I die, dump the money on the kids no matter what's going on. Are they going through a divorce? Have they declared bankruptcy? Doesn't matter. Throw the money at them regardless. Because you set it up 20 years ago. You don't know what's going to be going on with the kids when the money goes there. It could be fine, or it might not be.
That's one of those fancy stuff where you go online and you fill out the form and you hit print.
Precisely. You just zoom right over there and it'll get the job done. So we'll hold off on generational asset protection for another video, because this one here, we're talking primarily about what can you do to set things up, guard yourself, your spouse, your immediate family there. And that's where we start getting into the asset protection area, asset protection type trusts. And there's different types of trusts even within this area. There are some, and this is the one that people are most familiar with, where you give up all control. It's called a completed gift trust, where basically what you're saying is, I'm giving everything away and putting some other person in charge. That's mainly done for for estate tax purposes, which, given that our current estate tax exemption is $11.5 million per person, so you're just shy of 23 million as a married couple, estate tax concerns are not a major concern for an awful lot of people. If they are, there are other solutions there. But people don't like completed gift trusts, and I don't blame them. You have to give up all control. Now, if you have enough money, giving up that amount of control might be worth it for the potential tax savings. That's everyone's situation is different. But for most people, if we're able to get them the asset protection, shield things from lawsuits, shield things from the cost of long-term care, and do that without giving up control, where you still retain the ability to live in the house, live in the cottage, rent the property, do what you want with those assets, but they're protected in the event of a lawsuit or long-term care expense, that's a win-win right there.
For sure. And it always goes to what are the goals of the individual that we're sitting there talking to. Are we protecting from long-term care? Are you a high-risk professional that you can't separate out personal liability with a corporate structure? CPAs, doctors, physicians come to mind pretty quickly. Us as attorneys, where you're paying a lot in malpractice insurance, some level of asset protection is absolutely necessary. And
you said that quickly, and I think it's really, really important to go back, and we'll just say that one more time. We've been talking about LLCs on the business structure point of view. That works if you are not a professional. If you're talking about something like a rental property or maybe like a construction company or something like that. But professionals, like attorneys, like doctors, do not have that same degree of limitation as a professional. So if you have a PLLC, for example, they can still come after you directly, which is why we have so much malpractice insurance, so much liability insurance as attorneys, as doctors, because there is a potential for personal liability that doesn't exist with these other structures. So really important to be aware of that, kind of to what degree you're covered or not covered in that situation.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, it's definitely a good thing.
Yeah.
Pat, there's so much we can talk about here. I
Mhm.
want to dive deeply into, how do we do this, and
Okay.
who are the appropriate people this is for. So, any last things we want to touch on today before we spend another half hour talking about, maybe how do we do this for long-term care, and what is Medicaid and planning and all of that?
For sure. I think a lot of it comes down to personal comfort level, personal risk tolerance. From my point of view, there are kind of two big camps of folks where asset protection is almost a no-brainer to me, and then with other people, it gets to be more of a where are you comfortable or not comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
A number one is folks who are retired, post-retirement, where there is a likelihood of a long-term care need. And I mean, quite frankly, you can look at all these different statistics, but it is a much, much greater than 50% chance that someone who is 55 or older in the United States today will need long-term care at some point. Now, whether that's a few weeks of rehab or years of skilled care, it works out basically to be about 12% of people needing prolonged, meaning multi-year long-term care. So I think pretty much everyone in that age demographic, because that's such a concern, it just makes sense protecting from long-term care. And then the other end is professionals, physicians, attorneys, dentists, people who are at a much higher risk for lawsuit than the average bear, for whom the corporate structure is not the total bar that it might be in other situations. So those two groups. And then there's just sort of kind of everyone else, and depending on risk tolerance. If you have rental properties, at the very least, you need to have the proper corporate structure in place. It's fairly simple, fairly straightforward, and it can save you, just endless heartache down the road if something were to go sideways. A lot of asset protection, and this is just to kind of loop back to what you were saying earlier, where you have to have it set up before the incident takes place. After the liability is there, you're just trying to clean things up. And sometimes you can clean things up really well, but it's the different. You were using a car accident as an example, and I think that's perfect because I view this type of protection planning as wearing a seatbelt. You put it on, you hope you never need to use it, but if you do, thank God you were wearing it in the first place. But it does you no good to try to buckle it up after the accident, right? You have to put it on beforehand. And you can go out driving 10,000 times and you're not getting in an accident. But on 10,001, when you do, you're glad you made a habit out of it. And that's just how I view asset protection, is going through things without having that planning in place is just crossing your fingers and hoping nobody pulls out from behind the stoplight.
For sure. Your seatbelt example just reminded me of all the changes we have currently in Michigan related to auto insurance, which just almost makes this a thing for almost everyone, because they're expecting that litigation in the state of Michigan could double, even triple, because of lack of insurance that people have. They're going to lower their premiums. And I know you know the answer to this. I mean, there's so many lawsuits filed every day in the U.S. I mean, there's some crazy numbers. You're the numbers guy. What are those?
Yeah. So the U.S. has, on average, 40 million lawsuits a year. We have something like 90% of all the lawsuits on the planet are filed in the United States. We've got something like 85% of the lawyers. I mean, Americans think of lawsuits as just a regular thing. They think of seeing those lawyer billboards. They think about people getting sued as something that happens all the time. That's uniquely American. We spend almost 2.5% of our GDP is spent on lawsuits. Just think about that for a second. 2.5, it's like 2.2% of our entire GDP, like $300 billion we spend each year just on lawsuits. It's wild. And Michigan, as of July 1, so we're 2 weeks into it now, has become the new Wild West when it comes to automotive lawsuits, just because of all these new insurance changes. So that is something that Michiganders have not ever had to worry about. Michigan's auto insurance is different than all other states, and it just changed in a way that is potentially going to open a lot of people up to litigation.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And one of the goals of doing this most times is it's one to take your assets off the table, make them unavailable in the event of a lawsuit, but also it stops litigation kind of in its tracks. And what I mean by that is, as lawyers, when we're evaluating, not we, but as a general group of individuals, when we're evaluating taking a case, a lot goes into it. Like, what are the damages for the person? Is the person collectible? And so if finding out that that person is not easily collectible because they have protected their assets, it can then just stop it before it even happens. You don't even have to get involved in the process of litigation because they know in advance that this person is going to be difficult to tap into their assets.
Precisely. I mean, I was an insurance litigator before I started doing this, and I was on the defense side. But depending on who was getting sued and talking with plaintiffs' attorneys on the other side, that plays a huge factor. I mean, they look into it. Most of those cases, I know some of us know, but maybe folks listening don't. Not all, but a huge number of plaintiffs' lawsuits are taken based on contingency. The attorney takes no money up front. They get paid a percent of whatever they're able to recover. So if they look at it and somebody's got a trust in place and they've got the assets properly structured that way, they'll look at that and say, you know what, there's no way we're getting anything out of it. They might not even take the case in the first place, or they'll try to settle for a much lower number rather than say, oh, look, they got a cabin over here, they got their home, they got these investments over here. We're gonna get after that, right? It's a totally different mindset.
For sure, for sure. All right, Pat, I think we're going to wrap on that today.
Very good.
The Pat and Mike Show from the Rakowski Law Firm, estate preservation and asset protection attorneys. We're going to continue this conversation next week, same time, same place, Tuesdays at noon. You can go to our website, check it out at rutkowskilawfirm.com, RUTKOWSKI lawfirm.com. And we look forward to educating you guys a little bit more next week. If you like the content, please share it out, like our YouTube channel, and we'll catch you guys next week.
Sounds good. Mike, take care.
You as well.